Item 1, Monetary Authority of Singapore Amendment Bill, second reading.
Minister Lawrence Wong.
Mr. Speaker, I'm taking this bill on behalf of the Senior Minister and Minister in charge of the MAS, and I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time. As Singapore's central bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, or the MAS, conducts monetary policy to maintain medium-term price stability, which is necessary for sustained growth of the economy. MAS conducts monetary policy by managing the nominal effective exchange rate of the Singapore dollar, or the Sing-Near, within a policy band. When global financial or economic conditions cause the Sing-Near to be subject to significant strengthening or weakening pressures that are inconsistent with domestic price stability, MAS may intervene in the foreign exchange market to sell or buy Singapore dollars to keep the Sing-Near within the policy band. The Official Financial Reserves, or OFR, plays an important role in the MAS's conduct of monetary policy and support of financial stability. It gives confidence in Singapore's exchange rate-centered monetary policy framework, particularly during periods of speculative pressure or financial crisis when MAS will need to use its OFR to purchase Sing dollars to defend the exchange rate. Conversely, in periods of appreciation pressures on the Sing dollar, MAS can also sell Sing dollar in exchange for foreign currency to keep the Sing-Near within the policy band. When this happens, MAS accumulates foreign assets and its OFR grows. MAS invests the OFR mainly in safe and liquid assets so as to ensure that the OFR is available at short notice when needed. For example, to fend off a speculative attack on the Sing dollar, which could potentially undermine confidence in the Singapore economy. Singapore's excess of domestic savings over investments and persistent capital inflows, in part reflecting Singapore's AAA credit rating and the abundant liquidity in global financial markets, have meant strong appreciating pressures on the Sing dollar. If left unchecked, the Sing-Near was strengthened much more than necessary to keep inflation low and stable. As MAS intervened in the foreign exchange market to dampen appreciation pressures on the Sing-Near, it has been steadily accumulating OFR beyond that which it estimates is required to fulfill its monetary policy and financial stability mandate. The optimal amount of OFR that MAS estimates it needs is currently around 65% to 75% of GDP. There is no strict formula to determine this range, but it takes reference from a range of internationally used measures of reserve adequacy that recognize the foreign currency needs of our small open economy that is heavily dependent on trade and financial transactions with the rest of the world. MAS has assessed that this amount of OFR should be able to provide a sufficient buffer against severe crisis in the global economy and financial markets. Today, the stock of OFR has grown to Singapore dollar $566 billion, or about 111% of GDP as at third quarter 2021. It is significantly above the range which I just mentioned. It would be inefficient for MAS to hold on to OFR beyond its needs because returns on the OFR will be limited by MAS's relatively safer and more liquid investment posture as a central bank. Indeed, it is for this reason that GIC was set up in 1981 to invest OFR that was not needed by MAS in longer-term, high-yielding assets rather than in liquid but low-yielding assets. The transfer of OFR from MAS to the government for management by GIC has therefore been a long-standing practice. For example, in 2019, MAS announced a transfer to the government of $45 billion of OFR after reviewing the optimal amount of OFR needed. To date, transfers of MAS's OFR to the government has been facilitated through a corresponding reduction in the government's Sing dollar cash deposits with MAS. In other words, there's a reduction of assets on MAS's balance sheet, which is matched by a reduction of liabilities. However, this transfer mechanism is increasingly facing constraints, and this is mainly because MES's accumulation of OFR has in recent years persistently outpaced the growth of government's deposits with MES, which are not growing as quickly due to smaller fiscal balances. For example, if we want to bring the current level of OFR to the upper end of the optimal range, or 75% of GDP, which is 75% of GDP, about $150 billion of OFR will have to be eventually transferred to the government. This is far in excess of the government's current deposits with MES. So we need a new instrument to effect the transfer of assets from MES to the government for long-term investment management. And to be clear, this transfer of assets does not increase the total size of the government's reserves. It is about shifting assets from MES to the government to be part of long-term investment management by the GIC. So the bill sets out legislative amendments that will introduce powers in the MES Act for MES to subscribe for a new type of non-marketable security issued by the government solely to facilitate such transfers of OFR that is not needed for MES's mandate. This new security is called Reserves Management Government Securities, or RMGS. The amendments will allow MES to subscribe for RMGS issued by the government under the Government Securities Act as consideration for OFR that is transferred to the government for longer-term investment management by GIC. In introducing this bill, MES and the government have sought to ensure that MES's ability to fulfill its mandate is not affected. Two sets of safeguards have therefore been proposed in both the MES Act and the Government Securities Act to tightly circumscribe the conditions for MES's subscription of RMGS and the government's issuance of RMGS, and I will provide further details about each set of safeguards. The first set of safeguards seeks to robustly address potential misperceptions of monetary financing, in other words, MES financing, the government spending. Currently, MES is already prohibited under the MES Act from lending to the government or subscribing for government securities, apart from limited exceptions such as to conduct monetary policy or to develop the bond market in Singapore. Similarly, there are existing safeguards under the Government Securities Act today, where the government's proceeds for borrowing are accounted for in the Government Securities Fund and can only be used for investments. Thus, borrowings by the government in the form of RMGS will not increase the amount available for spending by the government. The bill will add safeguards in the MES Act and the Government Securities Act to avoid any misperception that RMGS will constitute monetary financing of government spending. First, the bill will empower MES to subscribe for RMGS for the sole purpose of facilitating the transfer of OFR to the government, and MES can do so only if the subscription does not compromise its objective of ensuring medium-term price stability. Second, the bill will require MES to use only foreign assets to subscribe for RMGS, and correspondingly the government to accept only foreign assets in exchange to be accounted for in the Government Securities Fund. This draws a clear and direct link between MES's RMGS subscription and the transfer of MES's OFR to the government, and eliminates the possibility that MES as a central bank creates Sing dollars to finance government spending. The bill will introduce within the Government Securities Act a separate net issuance limit for RMGS, which will be $580 billion. Of this amount, about $185 billion represents the amount which MES will have to transfer to the government in phases to bring the level of OFR back to the optimal range. The bulk of the remainder is estimated based on the expected pace of OFR accumulation in future years. The separate net issuance limit differentiates RMGS from other types of government borrowings. Transfer amounts and hence RMGS issuance depends on the accumulation of OFR, which is driven mainly by MES's conduct of monetary policy. This in turn is affected by financial market factors that can be uncertain. So having a separate limit for RMGS will ensure that the planned issuance of other government securities and treasury bills are not affected should the issuance of RMGS be higher than projected. Conversely, it will also avoid creating additional unintended borrowing space for other government securities and treasury bills should RMGS issuance be lower than expected. For transparency, MES will publish the outstanding RMGS amounts each month. The government financial statements will also state the total gross issuance and total gross redemption of RMGS in addition to the outstanding RMGS amount. So that's the first set of safeguards. A second set of safeguards will preserve MES's access to sufficient OFR to fulfill its mandate of conducting monetary policy and ensuring financial stability. The bill sets out in the MES Act that any subscription for RMGS can only be made for the purposes of transfer of OFR in excess of the amount MES considers necessary for the conduct of monetary policy. MES alone determines the amount of OFR required to meet its mandate and consequently the amount of OFR which can be transferred to the government. The government plays no role in this decision. Consequently, MES also determines the amount and timing of its RMGS subscriptions to effect transfers of OFR, and the government cannot independently effect a transfer of OFR from MES. The bill also sets out in the Government Securities Act that RMGS will be issued subject to such conditions as to repayment and redemption as may be agreed between MES and the government. These conditions will safeguard MES's access to sufficient OFR to implement monetary policy and support financial stability. For example, MES will have the right to redeem RMGS before maturity at par to meet its OFR needs in support of the conduct of monetary policy and financial stability. We expect that the optimal amount of OFR held by MES will comfortably meet its needs under most circumstances. Hence, MES's redemption of RMGS before maturity will likely be needed to supplement OFR only in a tail risk event. When MES redeems RMGS at or before maturity, MES will be repaid in foreign assets. These conditions will ensure that the RMGS on MES's balance sheet can readily support MES's ability to fulfill its mandate if necessary. In conclusion, sir, this bill will allow MES to subscribe for RMGS issued by the government for the sole purpose of facilitating continued transfers of MES's OFR to the government for longer-term investment by GIC. RMGS will enable such transfers to be sustained over the longer term. While the government will take on more debt as a result of RMGS, borrowing is not revenue, and the introduction of RMGS does not increase what the government can spend. The government's approach towards borrowing remains unchanged. The government's borrowings is for non-spending purposes, with the exception of the recently introduced SINGA to finance spending on nationally significant infrastructure. This bill will also put in place safeguards to ensure that RMGS will not and cannot be used for government spending, and that MES will continue to have ready access to the transferred OFR to support MES's ability to fulfill its mandate as necessary. Further, the nominal increase in government debt through RMGS will be matched by an increase in assets with no change in the government's net asset position. The government continues to have a strong balance sheet with no net debt. RMGS does not change this, as all RMGS issuances are only used to facilitate transfer of assets for longer-term investments. Mr. Speaker, sir, I beg to move.